The morning sun spilled through the tall glass windows of Harrison University, painting streaks of gold across the marble floors. It was a kind of place that smelled of privilege and intellect, the kind of place that pretended to be open to everyone, yet had invisible doors that some people could never walk through. Down the polished hallway of the mathematics department, students gathered in clusters, laughing, scrolling through their phones, and talking about exams and equations that would shape their futures. At the end of the corridor, in a small room that smelt faintly of bleach and old coffee, a man named Elijah Turner wrung out a mop and started cleaning. Elijah was in his late 30s, tall, broad-shouldered, with skin deep and rich like dark mahogany. His hands were rough, the kind that told stories of hard work, but his eyes held something else, a quiet intelligence, a kind of fire that didn't belong to someone society called the janitor. He worked silently, humming to himself as the sound of chalk on board echoed from the lecture hall nearby. Inside that hall, Professor Leonard Briggs, one of the most celebrated mathematicians in the state, was lecturing to a crowd of nearly 200 students. He was brilliant, charming, and utterly aware of it. His students idolized him, some out of admiration, others out of fear. Briggs loved the attention, loved being the man in control of knowledge, the one everyone looked up to. That morning, he stood before a massive whiteboard covered in complex symbols, integrals, matrices, and loops that twisted across the board like vines. He turned to his class and smirked. "All right, geniuses," he said, tapping the chalk against the board. "I'll give you a little challenge. Solve this equation, and whoever gets it right, I'll give them an A for the semester. Or better yet," he chuckled, turning toward one of his assistant professors, a woman who'd been rolling her eyes all morning. "Solve this, and I'll marry you." The class erupted in laughter. The joke wasn't new. Professor Briggs loved playing the arrogant genius, the one who thought no one could ever reach his level. The equation he'd written wasn't from any textbook. It was something he created himself, a hybrid of unsolved mathematical concepts, something designed to look impossible. As the laughter died down, Elijah pushed his mop bucket quietly past the open door. His steps were slow and respectful. He didn't want to disturb anyone. But something about that equation caught his eye. He froze. Numbers and symbols scattered across the board like an ancient language, yet somehow they made sense to him. Not instantly, but in a way that tugged at something deep in his mind. Briggs noticed him standing there. "May I help you, sir?" he said sharply. The class turned, curious. Elijah blinked and stepped back. "Sorry, sir. I was just cleaning up." "Oh, no, by all means," Briggs said sarcastically. "Maybe you want to take a crack at it." The students laughed again. Elijah's eyes dropped for a moment. Then they lifted, calm and unwavering. "Just admiring your work," he said softly. Briggs smirked. "Admiring it is all you can do. This project is beyond even my grad students' capabilities." Elijah nodded, gave a small polite smile, and moved on down the hall. But inside his mind, something had already clicked. The equation stayed with him. It lingered, whispered. That night, after finishing his shift, Elijah sat at a small wooden table in his tiny apartment on the edge of town. The room was neat but sparse, a single bed, a bookshelf stacked with old maths and physics books, and a chalkboard nailed to the wall. The books were worn, their pages yellowed, but their spines told a secret story, principles of theoretical mathematics, quantum structures and probability, and foundations of abstract algebra. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and replayed the equation in his mind. He remembered every line, every curve, every symbol. His mind was photographic like that. Slowly, he picked up a piece of chalk and began writing. The board filled quickly, his handwriting neat, almost elegant. Hours passed unnoticed. Midnight came and went. The world outside was silent except for the hum of a single streetlight through his cracked window. At 3 a.m, Elijah stepped back. His eyes widened. His chest rose and fell with disbelief. The equation wasn't unsolvable. It was flawed, not because it was wrong, but because it was incomplete. Professor Briggs had created something close to brilliance but left a small gap, a missing bridge between two ideas. Elijah had found that bridge. His hand trembled as he wrote the final line, and when he finished, he whispered almost to himself, "You missed it, Professor. The next morning, as the sun painted the city gold again, Elijah walked into the university early. His janitor's uniform was pressed and clean. He carried a small folded piece of paper in his pocket, his solution. Briggs was already in the lecture hall, preparing his notes. The students hadn't arrived yet. Elijah stood in the doorway, waiting for a moment to speak. "Morning, Professor," he said quietly. Briggs turned, slightly surprised. "Oh, it's you? Early as always." "Yes, sir. I couldn't stop thinking about that equation you wrote yesterday." Briggs chuckled. "Still thinking about it? That's dedication." Elijah hesitated, then unfolded the paper. "I took the liberty of working through it. I know it wasn't my place, but I thought maybe you'd want to see this." Briggs raised an eyebrow, amused. "You solved it." "I believe so." The professor smirked, took the paper with exaggerated politeness, and began scanning it. His amusement lasted exactly 5 seconds. Then it vanished. His eyes froze on the symbols. His hand stopped moving. He read it once, then twice. His jaw tightened. The room felt suddenly heavier. The sounds of students arriving faded to a distant blur. "This," he whispered. "How did you?" Elijah stood silently, hands folded in front of him. "Just something I've always been interested in. Numbers." Briggs's face shifted between disbelief and something else, discomfort, maybe shame. He knew what he was looking at. Elijah's solution wasn't a guess. It was precise, elegant, and original. The janitor had not only solved his equation, he had corrected it. He tried to hide his reaction, but one of the students, who had arrived early, saw the paper. "Professor, what is it?" Briggs cleared his throat, his arrogance faltering. "Nothing. Just a small miscalculation." Elijah gave a faint nod and turned to leave. "Have a good day, Professor." Briggs stood there, silent, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. When Elijah disappeared down the hallway, the professor sat at his desk and stared at the board. For the first time in years, he felt something he wasn't used to feeling: humility, and maybe fear, because deep down, he knew that brilliance didn't belong to titles or degrees. It lived where it wanted to, even in the hands of a man who mopped the floors. The next day, Harrison University buzzed with something that felt almost electric. Whispers traveled faster than light through those grand marble hallways, whispered in classrooms, cafeterias, and study lounges. Someone had solved Professor Briggs' impossible equation. And not just anyone, the janitor. No one knew how the rumor started, but by noon, every corridor seemed alive with it. Students leaned over lunch tables, half disbelieving, half intrigued. Some laughed it off. "Come on, man, the janitor solved that equation." Others, quieter, wondered if maybe it was true. Professor Leonard Briggs, on the other hand, was trying his hardest to bury it. He sat alone in his office, the blinds drawn, Elijah's handwritten solution still lying on his desk. He'd read it 5 times now, each time finding something new to marvel at, and something new to fear. The man had not only solved it, but had expanded on Briggs' own mathematical logic with a clarity that made Briggs himself feel small. He sighed and rubbed his temples. A janitor. The word echoed in his mind like an accusation. There was a knock at the door. "Come in," he said. It was Dean Whittaker, a sharp-featured woman with steel-gray hair and a reputation for running the university like a ship. She had heard the rumor, too. "Leonard," she said, closing the door behind her, "I've been hearing some interesting talk about your unsolvable equation. Care to explain?" Briggs shifted in his chair. Just student gossip. It's nothing." "The gossip says the janitor solved it." Briggs froze, then gave a dismissive laugh. "Nonsense. It's just a coincidence. The man is bright, perhaps, but is no mathematician." Whittaker crossed her arms. "And yet, the gossip insists the solution impressed even you. I know you, Leonard. You don't impress easily." Briggs hesitated. For a moment, his pride wanted to lie. But something about the dean's piercing gaze disarmed him. He sighed. He solved it, he admitted quietly, correctly, perfectly. Whittaker's eyebrows lifted. And I don't know how. Silence hung between them. Whitaker finally spoke. If this is true, we owe him acknowledgement. Briggs looked up sharply. Is a janitor, Dean, not a student, not a faculty member. Do you have any idea what it would look like if... What it would look like, she interrupted coldly, is that Harrison University recognized brilliance, regardless of where it came from. Or are you suggesting otherwise? Her tone carried an edge that sliced through his excuses. Briggs didn't respond. Find him, she said. Bring me his work. I want to see it myself. When she left, Briggs sat in silence, staring at the paper again. It terrified him, not because of what it proved, but because of what it exposed. That all his privilege, his accolades, his polished education, could still be humbled by someone the world refused to see. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of campus, Elijah Turner was pushing his mop down another hallway, humming under his breath. To him, life hadn't changed. He had work to do, floors to clean, and bills to pay. But the looks were different now. Students glanced at him longer than usual. Some smiled nervously, others whispered behind his back. One or two even approached him. Hey, are you the guy who solved Professor Briggs' equation? Elijah paused midwipe, giving a small, embarrassed smile. I don't know about solved. I just worked through it. So it's true. He chuckled softly. Let's just say numbers have always made sense to me. The student grinned in disbelief. That's wild, man. But not everyone found it admirable. Later that day, as Elijah was emptying trash bins near the math wing, a group of students, 3 young men in crisp university sweatshirts, cornered him. They looked amused, their voices dripping with condescension. Yo, genius, one said. Heard you made our professor look stupid. Elijah kept his eyes on his work. Just doing my job, fellas. Another one snorted. Nah, man, you really think you're smarter than us? You clean up our classrooms. You're not one of us. Elijah didn't reply. Years of enduring the same tone, in other jobs, other places, had taught him the value of silence. The third student stepped closer, lowering his voice. You think solving one equation changes anything? You'll still be mopping this floor tomorrow. Elijah looked up then, not angry, not defensive, just calm. Maybe, he said softly, but if you ever drop something valuable on this floor, I'll be the one to find it. The boys didn't quite understand what he meant, but the confidence in his voice made them step back anyway. When they left, Elijah continued mopping. His rhythm was steady and peaceful, but inside, something stirred, a quiet storm. Not anger, not revenge, just the awareness that truth didn't need to shout to be heard. That evening, as the campus emptied, Dean Whitaker visited him personally. Elijah Turner, she asked as he turned from the supply closet. Yes, I'm Dean Whitaker. I've heard about your work on Professor Briggs' equation. Elijah's heart thudded once, heavy and slow. Oh, yes, I didn't mean to cause any trouble. Trouble, she said, almost amused. You solved something half this department couldn't. I'd call that a contribution. He smiled awkwardly. I don't have any credentials. Just curiosity. Curiosity, she repeated thoughtfully. That's what every great mind begins with. She gestured for him to sit. Tell me, Mr. Turner, where did you learn mathematics? He hesitated. Nowhere official. My father was a mechanic. He used to fix things that people said were too far gone. I guess I just learned to see patterns. And books? He nodded. I've read everything I could get my hands on. Public libraries, used stores. Sometimes the trash bins outside the math department have old textbooks. Whitaker's expression softened. She had met many scholars in her life, but few who spoke of learning with such quiet reverence. Elijah, she said, choosing her words carefully, if you're interested, I'd like you to come to a small meeting tomorrow morning. Just a few of our faculty members. We'd like to see your method, how you approach the problem. Elijah blinked. You want me to explain it? Yes, if you're comfortable. He smiled faintly. I suppose I can try. When she left, Elijah sat alone for a long time. The mop stood in the corner, forgotten. The night air was cool, the campus silent. He thought of his mother, who had always said, "God gives everyone a gift. Son, the world just doesn't always know where to look for it." Tomorrow, maybe, the world would start looking. The next morning, the math department's small seminar room filled with quiet anticipation. A few professors, including Briggs, sat at the long oak table. Dean Whitaker stood at the front, professional and poised. Then Elijah walked in, still wearing his blue janitor uniform. He looked humble but not afraid. He carried nothing but a single notebook. Briggs avoided eye contact. "Elijah," Whitaker said warmly, "thank you for coming. Please, show us what you did." He nodded, walked to the board, and began writing. At first, the professors watched with polite interest. But as his chalk moved faster, the interest turned to astonishment. He explained each step with precision, his reasoning clean, his language simple yet profound. When he paused, the room was silent. One of the professors leaned forward. "Wait! Are you using combinatorial inversion here?" Elijah smiled. "Not exactly. That's the trick. The function cancels itself if you shift the variables. It's more about symmetry than inversion." They blinked, stunned. Briggs finally spoke. "You derived this from memory?" "Yes, sir." Whitaker folded her hands. "Mr. Turner, this is extraordinary." Elijah lowered the chalk. "It's just maths. It doesn't care who you are." There was something in that line, something that silenced everyone. The truth of it hung heavy in the air. After a long pause, Briggs stood. "Dean Whitaker," he said quietly, "I'd like to propose that Mr. Turner be offered an honorary research position. I'll personally sponsor it." Elijah's head snapped up in disbelief. Whitaker smiled. "That's the right call, Professor." For the first time, Briggs extended his hand. "You've reminded me that genius doesn't always wear a suit." Elijah hesitated, then shook his hand. Outside, the morning sun poured through the windows. Students passed by, unaware that something remarkable had just begun, that a man who cleaned their classrooms had rewritten what it meant to be brilliant. The following week changed everything. News traveled faster than lightning. The university newsletter published a brief but powerful line. "Custodial staff member Elijah Turner astounds the mathematics department by solving Professor Briggs' unsolved equation." Within days, social media picked it up. A photo of Elijah, standing humbly by a chalkboard covered in equations, went viral. Some captions celebrated him. "Genius is no title. Meet the janitor who outsmarted Professor." But not all voices were kind. The internet can be cruel when the wrong person shines too brightly. One post read, "Sure, a janitor solved an equation? Bet the professor helped him for publicity." Another sneered, "They are just playing diversity card again." Even on campus, the divide was sharp. Some students nodded respectfully when they saw him. Others smirked, whispering as he passed. It wasn't the fame that unsettled Elijah. It was how fragile people's respect could be. He didn't crave attention. All he wanted was peace. And maybe, for once, recognition that didn't come with disbelief. Professor Briggs, meanwhile, was caught between admiration and unease. The dean's praise, the press attention, all of it put him in the spotlight he hadn't expected. Every interview brought the same question. "Professor Briggs, how does it feel that your janitor solved your equation?" Each time, his smile tightened. "Mr. Turner is an exceptional mind," he'd say through gritted teeth. "It's an honor to have witnessed it." But inside, something twisted. Pride bruised by the realization that the world now admired the man he once mocked. He began to notice things he hadn't before. The way Elijah carried himself with quiet confidence, the respect students began to show him, and the small nods of gratitude from faculty. One evening, he found Elijah alone in the seminar room, studying a new problem on the board. Briggs paused by the door. "You're here late again," he said softly. Elijah turned, smiling faintly. "Numbers don't like waiting." Briggs stepped closer. "Do you realize what you've done? People are calling you a prodigy." Elijah shrugged. "Prodigy, janitor, genius, they're just words. I just like solving things." Briggs studied him for a moment. Do you ever think of pursuing this formally? I could help arrange that. Elijah hesitated. I appreciate that, sir, but I've applied to schools before. No one wanted a janitor without a degree. Briggs frowned. You have my word. I'll see that you get a chance this time. Elijah smiled. Maybe. But, sir, he looked down at the chalk dust on his fingers. People like me, we're often given chances that disappear once the cameras are gone. Briggs didn't know how to respond. By the next week, Harrison University announced something unprecedented. Elijah Turner would be offered a full scholarship and a research assistant position. The decision split the campus. In the student forums, debates erupted. Some called it historic. Others are unfair. One anonymous comment read, "So now janitors get scholarships just for cleaning equations too." Another said, "Good for him, but let's not act like he belongs in our department." The words burnt, but Elijah refused to let them take root. He remembered his mother's voice again. You can't stop people from talking, baby. You can only give them something worth talking about. The day he officially joined the department, the seminar hall was full. Professors, students, and even local reporters gathered. Cameras clicked as Dean Whitaker made the announcement. Elijah Turner, she said proudly, reminds us that brilliance does not depend on where one starts, but how one rises. Applause filled the hall. Briggs stood beside her, smiling politely, though his chest felt heavy. When Elijah stepped forward to shake hands with the dean, Briggs noticed the warmth in everyone's eyes, the kind he hadn't seen directed at himself in years. That night, as the applause faded and the news spread, Briggs sat alone in his office again, staring at the dark window. The reflection that looked back at him wasn't one of a proud scholar, but of a man confronted with his own prejudice. He remembered that day, the careless joke, the laughter, the arrogance. Solve this equation and I'll marry you. He had said it without thought, a line meant to belittle, not to challenge. And yet, Elijah had solved it. The truth gnawed at him. It wasn't just math Elijah had solved. He had solved him, stripped away every layer of academic pride until only humility remained. But the world doesn't easily allow black brilliance to stand unchallenged. Within a month, small obstacles began appearing. Elijah's funding was delayed. His name was omitted from one of the university's newsletters. Some professors avoided him during meetings. When he presented a new paper, expanding on his equation, one reviewer dismissed it as inspired but unpolished, without even reading it fully. Still, Elijah stayed composed. He'd face harder floors, colder winters, emptier stomachs. A few bureaucratic walls weren't enough to stop him. Instead, he doubled down, studying every night after his shifts, writing until dawn. His work began to gain quiet respect in online math communities. Scholars from abroad reached out, asking for his insights. And yet, inside the university walls, silence grew heavier. One late evening, Briggs found him in the lab again, surrounded by papers and equations. "Elijah," he said softly, "they are trying to hold you back." Elijah didn't look up. "They are just doing what they've always done, say, testing my patience." Briggs took a deep breath. "No, this isn't right. You've earned your place here." Elijah finally looked at him, his expression calm but firm. "With respect, Professor, I didn't come here to earn a place. I came to use the one I already had." That line hit Briggs like a blade of truth. Elijah stood, stretching his back. "They'll come around. Maybe not for me, but for the next one. That's what matters." As he left, Briggs stared at the half-erased equations on the board, marks of genius that would someday rewrite the story of a university. 2 weeks later, a storm hit the academic world. A leading science journal published Elijah's work, not just a solved equation, but an entirely new theorem derived from it. It was reviewed, verified, and hailed as revolutionary. The title read, "Symmetry Beyond Limits, a New Framework by Elijah Turner." The cover photo, Elijah, standing in his old janitor uniform beside a chalkboard. The world noticed. Universities called. News outlets requested interviews. Celebrities tweeted about him. But the one thing that touched Elijah most was a handwritten note slipped under his door. "You don't just clean floors. You clean doubt from the hearts of those who stopped believing. M.W." He didn't know who M.W. was, but he smiled softly and tucked the note into his notebook. With fame came backlash. Certain circles dismissed his work as accidental genius. Others tried to credit Briggs. Some conservative papers ran headlines like, "Can a janitor really be a mathematical genius?" Elijah ignored it all. He never fought for recognition, only understanding. And for the first time, he felt the quiet satisfaction of seeing truth ripple outward, whether people wanted it or not. He began mentoring a few underprivileged students from the nearby community center, teaching them maths with the same patience that had carried him all his life. One of them, a bright-eyed boy named Caleb, asked, "Mr. Elijah, do you ever get scared of not being good enough?" Elijah smiled. "All the time, son, but fear is just another equation. Once you understand what it's made of, you can solve it too." As the sun set over the campus one evening, Briggs joined Elijah on a bench overlooking the pool of reflection, the same one the janitorial staff used to clean. "Funny," Briggs said. "You've become the pride of the university." Elijah chuckled. "The same university that once told me I didn't belong." Briggs nodded slowly. "You've changed more than just a classroom, Elijah. You've changed me." Elijah looked out at the fading light. "Change is like maths, Professor. It looks impossible until you realize it always adds up." They sat in silence, two men from worlds apart, now bound by something larger than pride or education. That night, the dean called an emergency meeting. "We need to honor him," she said firmly. "A public recognition ceremony, not as charity, but as history." And so a date was set. Elijah Turner, the man who once swept the hallways, would stand on the same stage where generations of scholars had lectured. But what none of them expected was what Elijah would say when given the microphone. Because for Elijah, this wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of a revolution. The grand auditorium of Harrison University had never been so full. Every seat taken, every wall humming with anticipation. Students, professors, alumni, and journalists all gathered to witness what many called a historic moment in modern academia. At the front stood the stage, polished wood, heavy velvet curtains framing a single podium. Behind it, a large projection screen displayed a photograph of Elijah Turner, the janitor who solved the impossible. The dean's voice echoed through the speakers. "Today," she began, "we gather not to honor status, but substance. Not position, but perseverance. Mr. Elijah Turner reminded us that intellect is not defined by privilege and that brilliance can rise from any corner of this earth." Thunderous applause. Backstage, Elijah stood quietly, his hands clasped. He wore a simple dark suit, one he'd borrowed from Professor himself. His mother's worn cross hung around his neck. When the applause quieted, Dean Whittaker smiled toward the side curtain. "Elijah Turner," she said softly, "the floor is yours." Elijah stepped out slowly. The crowd rose in a standing ovation before he'd even said a word. He froze for a moment, overwhelmed by the sight, faces shining under stage lights, cameras flashing, whispers of awe rippling like soft waves. He smiled shyly, nodding once before gesturing for them to sit. "Thank you," he said, his voice low but steady. "I'll be honest, I've stood in this room before. But back then, I was holding a mop, not a microphone." A soft ripple of laughter moved through the hall. He continued, "I remember the sound this floor makes when you polish it right. It's smooth, like glass. I used to listen to it echo as students hurried by, talking about theories and futures. I used to wonder what it felt like to be seen, not just pass." He paused. When Professor Briggs wrote that equation on the board, it wasn't meant for me. It was meant for minds that already had the world's permission to think. But sometimes, life gives you moments that don't ask for permission. They just happen. The audience leaned forward. "I didn't solve that equation to prove anyone wrong. I solved it because the numbers spoke to me, the way music speaks to a singer, or colors speak to a painter. Math has never cared about skin color, or job titles, or which side of the mop you stand on. The truth just is." His words carried a quiet gravity, the kind that stays the soul rather than shocks it. He took a deep breath, his voice softening. "But I want to tell you something harder to solve than any equation. It's something I've lived with my whole life. It's the look people give you when they think they already know your story. He looked across the audience at the rows of young faces, the professors, and the skeptics. I've been invisible most of my life. When I swept your halls, you didn't see me. When I cleaned your trash, you didn't think twice. But invisibility doesn't mean absence. Sometimes, the people you overlook are the ones holding your world together. Silence. You could hear the sound of his breath through the microphone. I've heard people say I got lucky, that this is a miracle. But I don't believe in luck without labor. I believe in showing up, even when nobody calls your name. I believe in studying when no one sees your light on. I believe in cleaning floors with the same care you'd solve an equation, because both take patience and both reveal who you are. A few people wiped their eyes. He glanced toward the front row, where Professor Briggs sat, his eyes shining with emotion. There was a time, Elijah said, when a man laughed at me, not because he was cruel, but because he couldn't imagine that someone like me could stand where he stood. And that's a problem, isn't it? We've built walls out of expectation. But truth doesn't live in walls. It lives in the open, in the places nobody bothers to look. He stepped away from the podium now, closer to the edge of the stage. Every generation has its equations, problems the world says can't be solved. Maybe it's poverty. Maybe it's racism. Maybe it's a fear that keeps you small. But if I've learnt anything, it's that impossible things don't get solved by the people who fit in. They get solved by the people who don't. The audience erupted in applause, not loud or chaotic, but thunderous and emotional, the kind that rises from somewhere deep inside. When it quieted, Elijah smiled faintly. So if you remember anything from my story, he said, don't remember that a janitor solved an equation. Remember that a human being refused to believe he couldn't. And then he looked directly at the students in the front row, young black men and women, their eyes wide, their hearts trembling with new belief. Never wait for permission to be brilliant. The standing ovation that followed shook the hall. Even the professors who once doubted him stood wiping tears from their eyes. Dean Whitaker stepped forward, her voice thick with pride. Mr. Toner, she said, on behalf of this institution and every student who will ever walk these halls, we thank you, not just for solving an equation, but for solving something far more important, the equation of dignity. After the ceremony, reporters surrounded Elijah, microphones flashing. How does it feel to be called a genius? One asked. He smiled softly. Feels the same as mopping floors, just a different kind of clean. Another asked, what's next for you? He paused. Teaching. Not in classrooms, but wherever someone believes they can't learn. I want to remind them that knowledge doesn't belong to the few. It belongs to the hungry. Weeks passed. The world moved on to other headlines, but Elijah stayed true to his promise. He began working part-time at a community center, teaching math to underprivileged kids. He still worked at the university in the evenings, not as a janitor now, but as a researcher and mentor. And sometimes, late at night, when the halls were empty and the moonlight gleamed off the polished floors, he'd stop for a moment, hand resting on his old mop, and whisper, thank you. To the floors that had listened, to the silence that had shaped him, to the equation that had changed everything. One evening, Professor Briggs found him again, this time in the same classroom where it all began. The blackboard stood clean, except for one corner where Elijah had written a new line. Genius is not what you know. It's what you refuse to stop learning. Briggs smiled. You've written something worth more than any theorem. Elijah chuckled. Well, I had a good teacher. No, Briggs said quietly. I had a good reminder. They stood there for a while, silent, two men connected not by pride or profession, but by truth. Years later, a plaque was mounted in that same classroom. It read, in honor of Elijah Turner, the man who solved more than equations. He proved that brilliance has no uniform, and dignity has no degree. Visitors often stopped to read it. Some smiled, some teared up, but every one of them left with something lighter in their hearts, the knowledge that greatness can rise from the quietest places. And if you listen closely, on some evenings when the wind moves just right, you can almost hear it. The soft rhythm of a mop sliding across the floor, steady and sure, keeping time with the heartbeat of a man who once refused to be unseen.